Hi everyone. So thanks very much for joining us this afternoon and welcome to Narrowing the Gap, Tackling the Digital Divide with the Education Policy Institute and Pearson. Today we're going to be discussing how technology can address the disadvantage gap during COVID and beyond, which is a topic I'm sure is very present in the minds of many of you here as children continue at school during lockdown. So we've got a really good panel with us today. Jon Coles, who's the United Learning Chief Executive, Sharon Hague, Senior Vice President at Pearson, Priya Lakhani OBE, who's the founder and CEO of Century, EdTech company, Wakeford MP, for Bury South, who more importantly for our purposes today sits on the Education Select Committee, and Becky Francis, the Chief Executive of the Education Endowment Foundation. So we'll hear some short opening statements to begin with from each of the panel, and then we'll move on to some questions. And everyone in the audience, I'd very much encourage you to submit questions if you can, using the chat function on Zoom, which hopefully people are relatively familiar with now. I'm going to start with Becky, who's going to speak about the impact of the digital divide on disadvantaged pupils and the importance of effective and evidenced interventions. As some of you may know, the EEF is renowned for its work in building robust evidence bases for education policy interventions, and Becky was previously director of the UCL Institute for Education and advisor to the Education Select Committee as well, so is very well positioned to speak to us about this. So Becky, please go ahead.
Thanks for that. Well, during the lockdown, remote learning looked very different between and within schools. The socioeconomic gap for educational progress is predicted to have grown over the lockdown period, as you know, and there's evidence that differences in provision of and engagement with remote and online learning will have widened existing gaps. Now, there's little robust evidence on what makes effective online teaching and learning, but many of the principles that underpin quality teaching in normal circumstances apply to remote schooling as well. We know that some pupils can learn effectively from home, but for remote learning to be effective, technology must enable access to high quality teaching. Now, of course, there also needs to be adequate access to devices and the internet to enable that, and ways found to encourage engagement as well. Even the best ed tech solution in the world will increase inequality if people from disadvantaged backgrounds can't access it. So that's fundamental. Now, of course, previously the ed tech sector has been notoriously producer driven. So it's vital that we rapidly build evidence here to enable schools to purchase and to develop wisely going forward. To that end, the EEF undertook a rapid evidence assessment of the relatively limited high quality research in this area to date. It's important to say that across all digital technology, it's important to focus on the best evidence for quality teaching practice first, rather than starting with exciting new technology. Things that contain high quality teaching practice, you know, assessing pupil needs, modelling and scaffolding, effective learning, effective feedback, and so on, have more of an impact than do different technologies. So the support that gets put around the technology in the school is crucial too. A lot of the evidence for EdTech has been gathered from settings where support from a teaching assistant or a teacher has been there in the classroom, and indeed it's been gathered from higher education very often as well. So schools need to consider how they give pupils an opportunity to request additional support that might not be provided within the EdTech itself. And we found that interactions with both the teacher and peers can provide motivation and improve learning outcomes too. So that's also important to factor in. and the implementation's crucial, as you'd expect. Lots of schools during lockdown went with technology they already knew rather than whizzy new things, and that was likely to be a good decision. We know that staff training, pupil understanding, and time to embed new technologies have an important impact on learning outcomes. So just to conclude my sort of key opening, the digital divide during the pandemic has further disadvantaged already socially disadvantaged pupils. Given that though there'll be no going back, schools are now using EdTech, it's important that we find ways to provide equality of access and that schools are supported to make best use of technology to enhance teaching quality and encourage engagement, including for those typically harder to reach pupils. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Becky. A good reminder there that we're probably talking about much more than just technology. So next, we're going to hear from Sharon. So as Vice President at Pearson, Sharon is responsible for overseeing assessment materials and teaching and learning kind of resources at Pearson. And she'll be telling us a bit more about how Pearson itself has been supporting schools and pupils with online learning during the pandemic. So please go ahead, Sharon.
Thanks, Bethan. So I've probably been asked at least once a year since joining Pearson, and I've been there just over 20 years now, what will be the catalyst for greater system-wide adoption of EdTech in the classroom and examinations? Not once did I answer it would be a global emergency, but I think that's what it's taken, and I really do believe this has been the catalyst for significant change in the use of EdTech. So when the pandemic first hit, we saw a huge surge in interest and engagement with online learning. So in the first 3 months following school closures at Pearson, we had more than 450,000 families sign up for the Maths Factor, an online maths tuition and personalised practice service. We're also proud to have supported over 500,000 students while the schools were closed with digital services such as Active Learn, which was at the forefront of our free support and was used by hundreds of thousands of families and schools. During the pandemic and school closures, we constantly refreshed and developed new content, including things like live lessons, collaborations with Oak Academy and the BBC, as well as providing fresh content for our online Power Maths Mastery Scheme and Bug Club services, and in addition some print materials as well to supplement what was happening online. So I do think that the change we have witnessed is irreversible, and there's plenty of data to back that up. So an OECD survey across 69 countries showed that just 22% of schools say they plan to return immediately to a full schedule of lessons and student attendance. And nearly 60% say they would move towards a more hybrid model of distance and classroom learning in the future, a statistic that was almost unthinkable just 6 months ago. And learners agree. So our recent global learning survey highlighted that 90% of students surveyed believe that online learning will be a permanent feature of primary, secondary and higher education moving forward. So we've drawn a few things from this year's experience. Firstly, that the resilience that digital and online learning can build into the system shouldn't be underestimated. It's really blurred that distinction between the school gate and the home environment and the role that homework can play in learning. And it's enabled greater personalisation of learning, really enabling teachers to track student progress and gather a detailed view of every student's performance. So looking ahead, we really want to support the sector, and we're collaborating with teachers and schools to undertake research that can inform practice really quickly, testing and learning as we go. We've launched a partner programme with multi-academy trusts and schools across the UK to help us build the next generation of our online teaching and learning services. And we're publishing a new report called Making Waves, which has been undertaken with the Centre for Education and Youth. And that really showcases some case studies illustrating the innovative assessment practices that teachers are adopting in the classroom, including the use of EdTech. We've also launched an on-screen mock marking service, and we're accelerating a lot of the work that we had been doing on online examinations, and there'll be more to share on this in the coming months. So I think the conclusions that we've drawn is that for EdTech to really be transformational, it does need to be developed in partnership with schools and teachers. We shouldn't forget that this year has been a massive learning curve, with schools and teachers learning as they go and embracing new technologies, testing, iterating and refining their approach at pace and as they learn. But that's not a new trend, it's just an acceleration of something that was already there and was already happening. So whilst there are lots of challenges, and I know other panellists will talk more about those, I do feel positive about the future and the difference that EdTech can make to pupils' progress and learning. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Sharon. Next, we have Christian Wakeford, who's, as I mentioned, the MP for Bury South and sits on the Education Select Committee, which has been interrogating the kind of policy and practice around education this year and asking some very important questions. So Christian, you're telling us a bit more about the committee's inquiry into the impact of coronavirus on schools. So yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Bethan. It seems a long time ago that we were actually discussing it, although I'll probably start by tweaking the topic from the impact of COVID on schools to the impact on education. And what we unfortunately saw was a widening of the attainment gap. So we're all aware of the statistics. So roughly 2 million children had little to no education during the first lockdown, which then came to roughly 6 months by the time schools went back in September. And now, whilst we have a very different view on education in that it will be the last thing to close and the first thing to reopen with any further lockdowns like we're in now, unfortunately, it's taken a lot to actually recover from that first one. So the main issues we came across, some of which were well known to most people. So it was access to equipment. So whilst there was a big push for laptops to be sent to the most disadvantaged of pupils, unfortunately it took far too long. There weren't enough. There were issues with passwords. So by the time you were actually able to access an actual laptop, you were almost going back to school already anyway. So the damage by that point had already been done. In regards to the access to laptops, there was then the access to internet. I mean, there's no point having a laptop if you then can't actually access any form of broadband. So we've all heard stories of children using their parents' smartphone to actually try to have any form of access whatsoever. So while some don't have actual broadband, others were given dongles, but again, that then created a geographical divide where if it was city centres or more rural locations where you were in hotspots, then again you weren't able to access the education that is a basic human right, in my view. So some of this then was made even worse when you had multiple children per household but one laptop. Now I think back to when I grew up with my twin brother, and if it was one laptop, we'd probably be fighting over who got to use it at the time. So to try to prioritize who could have education either that hour or that day is not a conversation or an argument I would really be happy to get involved in. So we don't need to look at households, but the pupil numbers to actually be involved. We then had an actual issue where actually it was very varied depending in regards to what schools. Some went way above and beyond, and they have my respect and applause for doing so, and they were actually making regular calls and regular access to their children to make sure they weren't missing out. But some were very much along the lines of, well, access the Oak Academy. And don't get me wrong, the Oak Academy was great and set up very quickly, but that wasn't to replace education, that was to be a part of education. And unfortunately, I think that was a fallback for far too many schools. I think my biggest concern, and I say this not as a member of the Education Select Committee, but as a father to a toddler, we were focused very much on the educational attainment and the attainment gap, and rightly so, but we did very little in regards to early years. Now, for me, if you get early years correct, then that sets a child's educational career and plan up for for their duration of education. So, unfortunately, far too little was done in early years. That's been a long-standing issue and one I'm not happy with, and continue to raise both in committee and to the department. So I think for my own experience, we maybe had 2 Zoom chats with my daughter's key worker across a 2-month period. Now, granted, I had to start going back to London when my daughter was climbing up my lap and headbutting me in the face during conference calls. So anyone who went through the homeschooling deserves to give themselves a pat on the back. It was difficult for everyone, and again, my respect to everyone for having to pick up with no experience of education to basically run with it for several months. And then we have universities where we have one world-renowned university who deals with remote learning, but it feels like we've not really taken the expertise of the Open University, and I declare my interest as a graduate of the Open University, that we've not been pushing out that best practice. So going to a remote-only education for a lot of our institutions with no experience, unfortunately, we are having our students falling further behind because of it. So I'd like to see best practice shared more. I'd like to see more power given to schools rather than the centre. So why wait for your allocation of laptops? Devolve a budget and let the school be responsible, and that should hopefully speed up the process. So like I've said previously in the chamber, I would give a C for effort, but must improve.
Thanks very much, Christian. They're really great insights. I'm now going to ask Priya to speak. I'd just like to remind the panel, if possible, to keep opening statements to 3 minutes, if you can, so we have plenty of time for questions. Priya is going to talk about the potential for EdTech, and specifically EdTech and personalised learning in giving all children a quality education. Priya founded Century, as I'd mentioned, which combines learning science, AI, and neuroscience in digital tools to support learning. So yeah, please go ahead, Priya.
Thank you so much, Bethan. Just want to say thank you very much for having me today. So at Century, we've been developing technology, as Bethan described, which combines AI, big data, neuroscience, and learning science. And a true AI requires users to be online. We offered the technology for free to any school in the world from January that was affected by lockdown, which was quite disruptive to our business model. But it was really key because this sort of technology informs teachers of where interventions are necessary. And so if you think about a teacher interacting now only with his or her classroom online, on Teams or on Zoom, trying to actually capture where students are at and where to make interventions is really, really difficult. Whereas if you're using something that can analyze big data and provide those insights to teachers, with the tap of a button, the click of a button, then obviously those interactions on conferencing technology become a lot more powerful and you make your teacher more efficient. But there is obviously the question of, well, hang on, well, pre-COVID and when things settle down and when we're back at school, well, then that same technology can be used inside the classroom in a blended learning environment, in a flipped learning environment, by teachers, again, to stop wasting their time and stop spending 60% of their time micro-marking and micro-assessing. Now, pre-COVID, if you all think, and I know everyone here will be familiar with the Everett-Rogers adoption curve, it's that curve where you've got your innovators, your pioneers, your early adopters, your early majority, and then we very politely call the last lot the laggards, the kickers and the screamers. But if you think about that curve, where was this sort of personalized true AI? And I say true AI because all the audience and the viewers here need to understand there is a very big difference between AI, true AI technology, and adaptive technology. These technologies, this AI technology, was really very much an innovator and pioneer part of the adoption curve in terms of schools across the globe. We had a lot of state schools in the UK using the technology, but a lot of independent schools as well. With COVID, you saw that schools that were familiar with the technology but hadn't adopted it, so therefore they're sort of in the early majority, embraced it and took it on. But we also found that some later on in the curve, you would maybe classify as even the laggards, took on the technology because they had the devices, they had the infrastructure, and they needed to give something a go during lockdown. And that was quite surprising, I think, for everybody. But we definitely saw that when we classify our schools as to what they did pre-COVID and what they're doing now, it was really interesting. So Century went from about 11 schools in 11 countries to schools in 64 countries. And there were some lessons learned. And quickly, the lessons are, I think Becky mentioned this initially, but embedding is key. So any technology company, personalized learning company, whatever it is that flogs technology and isn't there for the journey to handhold schools is doing the wrong thing, right? They need to be able to demonstrate and train teachers on how to use it and how to embed the technology. Massive lesson on how to do that at scale online. Positive message from COVID is that previously, I don't think schools would have accepted that we would have trained them without being face to face. What was amazing was that there was one session where we traced 5,000 teachers in mass webinar training sessions online, because those stakeholders are now actually accepting, I'll meet you on Teams, I'll meet you on Zoom. So actually training and embedding online technology is a lot easier now that there's this acceptance of doing things online rather than having to take a train to, Worcester or to Manchester or wherever else, or to Pakistan where the 5,000 teachers were, to train them there. With maths, large multi-academy trusts, we still found with the multi-academy trusts, particularly in the state sector, it was better to pilot with a small group of them, 5 or 6 of them, and then roll out into the other 15 or 20 or more, just because then in those maths they had impact statements, evidence statements, and the impact statements were quantitative and qualitative. And that's where we trust our teachers, right? And I know that since the last debacle, we questioned, we really need to increase and raise the profile of the profession. But actually, teachers trust teachers within multi-academy trusts and within schools. So that qualitative impact and data is just as important as quantitative, which is sometimes very difficult to analyse without a randomised controlled trial. Last thing, there was a lot of pressure from parents. We had 20,000 emails saying, well, our school hasn't got it, so how do I get it? It took us 3 all-nighters. We built a direct to parent platform that was quite difficult. We did that during COVID and access was for free, but this is where we really learned about the issue. So the golden triangle for me, if you like, is you've got infrastructure, which is bandwidth online, you've got the devices, and you've got the software, the ed tech. If any of those 3 fall down, I always say you've not got an ecosystem. So it was really interesting to learn how, for example, DFE was working with digital or DCMS on infrastructure, because we have to all work together to figure out how to make sure that disadvantaged communities have access to not only devices that turned out were very delayed in their delivery, but also that they have the infrastructure and they're able to go online. I've run out of the 3 minutes, but obviously I'm very happy at any point to discuss how technology can address assessment for the disadvantaged, which has been a huge issue recently. And if somebody wants to ask questions or reach me directly, I'm very happy to discuss that later. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sure there'll be some questions coming through on that particularly, Priya. So yeah, we'll probably be returning to that at a later point anyway. Next, we've got David, who is Executive Chairman of EPI and served in the coalition government as Chief Secretary to the Treasury, as well as Schools Minister and other posts. So David is talking now about addressing the learning losses that have taken place during COVID, and also how government responses to minimising those losses through things like catch-up plans and other interventions have played out.
Great, Bethan, thank you very much for chairing this, and thanks to Pearson for enabling it as well. So obviously, we don't yet know reliably how much learning loss has taken place over the last 6 or 7 months and what has happened to the disadvantage gap. But all of the survey data that we've had to date, as some others have mentioned, does suggest, as we might expect, that there has been significant learning loss across the system as a whole, and that the disadvantage gap is likely to have widened. And we know specifically with online learning that children from lower income backgrounds seem to have had during the early lockdown something like 75 minutes less of online learning per day compared with more advantaged children. We also know, worth bearing in mind, that learning loss is sadly not over yet, and the learning loss occurring seems to be concentrated in the poorer areas, which for the time being have greater prevalence of COVID. And we saw in the attendance data from schools the other day that we've got some parts of the country, such as Knowlesley, where as few as 6 in 10 of secondary school pupils are in schools. So we mustn't take for granted that there won't be further learning loss over this term and next. In terms of trying to assess the extent of this learning loss and what's happened to the gap, we probably can't use the 2020 exams data even when that is available because of the impact of teacher assessed grades. But there are a number of organisations, including EPI, working to look at assessment data to see if we can come up with other estimates of the gap and how that has been changing. And we have a project that's funded by DFE where we're working in partnership with Renaissance to use their data to look at what's happening to the gap. Meanwhile, I think that the indications of learning loss and a wider gap that we've already seen do create a strong argument for the government to take action in this area, particularly given that the background is that the disadvantage gap has stalled and is no longer reducing, as we saw in 2019 for the first time for over a decade. So the government has taken a number of actions to try to help schools to catch up. There's been the additional digital help that Christian mentioned, the national tutoring programme that Becky's very much involved with, and the extra £650 million that has gone to schools across the country. I think there are some challenges here, though, for the government, and I'm just going to mention 3 or 4 and then finish. The first is there enough digital provision, particularly if children continue to have to learn from home? We know that a lot of extra equipment was deployed up to June, but a lot of disadvantaged students probably still haven't got the access that they need, and we arguably haven't been as ambitious as in some other countries. Secondly, as some of you have touched upon, is the quality of digital online learning delivery equal in all schools, even when children do have that access? There's quite a lot of evidence to suggest it isn't. Thirdly, is the additional finance that's being made available by the government both adequate in scale and adequately targeted? And one of our concerns at EPI has been that the way in which the government has targeted the non-national tutoring programme money, or rather allocated it, because it isn't targeted, is not aimed at the children who are likely to have fallen furthest behind. And then the very final point is this, to remember that there is a lot schools can do in terms of online learning and catch-up learning and the national tutoring programme. There's also a lot that goes on outside the school gate that needs to be the focus of other government policy interventions. We know that COVID has damaged the economy. It's likely to increase poverty. And we know that children who are in the most persistent poverty have a disadvantage gap which is twice the size of children who are poor but not in persistent poverty. So if we're living in a society where poverty is rising and persistent poverty is particularly going up, that's going to be a very big challenge, and it may need interventions beyond what is in the narrow departmental control of the DFE.
Thanks very much, David. Very pertinent to other UK news today as well, obviously. So finally, we're going to hear from Sir Jon Coles, the Chief Executive of United Learning, which is a group of over 80 academies and independent schools. Previously to this, Jon was at the Department of Education and its predecessors for 15 years in posts including Director of Education Standards and 14 to 19. And he's today discussing the barriers that trusts such as United Learning face and have faced during the pandemic in rolling out and adopting EdTech and delivering kind of online solutions for pupils. Thanks, Jon.
Thanks, Bethan. I think I've got -5 minutes, so I'll be quick. So, I mean, as Bethan said, we've got independent schools as well as academies in our group, and that's our sort of historic foundation. And it's been a really salutary experience and one of the most uncomfortable of my career, seeing just how big the difference has been between independent schools' ability to respond and other schools. And I say that in the context that I think our academies have done an exceptionally good job of responding. What I mean is, independent schools, because the market really for independent schools demands this, have all had for quite a long time digital strategies, which means one-to-one strategies. Every pupil has their own iPad as part of going to the school. Having a good digital strategy, we think, takes about 18 months to create, develop and implement. It is about having good strategy. It's about good training for staff. It's about a very careful and systematic approach to implementation. And because all of that was in place and absolutely routine and embedded in the way that the schools operated, on day one, many of our independent schools switched immediately to providing a full timetable exactly on the same basis as they normally would, just taught remotely through the iPad, and you know, with remarkable smoothness and facility, switched their whole provision over to that model, to the extent that one of my independent school heads said to me, look, I think we're probably, come the end of the summer term, I think we're probably a bit ahead of where we normally are in terms of curriculum coverage. So so there you have the kind of gap described in quite a kind of serious way. And I think that just in the way that I've described that, you'll see, you know, here are some big challenges. And I think they are, first of all, about provision. How do we get the right sort of online education in place at speed? And we took the view straight away that the way we had to do that on day one was to provide materials and teaching which could be accessed on a mobile phone, because for all the reasons that people have described, you know, if you're sharing a laptop or you don't have devices at home, you don't even have an internet capable device other than possibly a parent's mobile phone, still we have to be able to educate you. So so our initial work on provision really focused on providing asynchronous resources on day one, enabling schools to continue to teach. And so what I mean is things like the OAK lessons being provided by our staff on day one. Now, we were in a very fortunate position as a large trust, and you know, a group of people have been working on this stuff for a long time, of having teacher resources lesson by lesson across all the main curriculum subjects across Key Stage 2, 3 and 4, which could relatively quickly be turned into people-facing resources. So we have now got a set of people-facing resources on a people-facing website, which all children in our schools can log into and have access to a full online curriculum taught on video, accessible when they want, you know, on the OAK model. And in fact, 1,500 of the OAK lessons are our lessons, which are translated onto the OAK site and provided more widely as well. So that's sort of version one of provision. Alongside that, we started buying devices, because that's barrier number two. How do you make sure everybody's got a device? And during lockdown, we bought about 12,000 Chromebooks, which have been distributed to students. And I should stress, this is not having a digital strategy. This is emergency response. This is about relatively disposable devices being provided at pace to children. I'm pleased that we're going to, I think, have a lot more schools wanting, academies wanting a digital strategy in full now, and that's what we're working on with them at the moment. The next big problem, though, I think, is not really a very soluble problem. It's a place to work. It's kids having somewhere in disadvantaged communities where they can quietly work. It's a sort of room of one's own type problem, and it's very difficult to fix that as a group of schools. So that seems to me, for some of our young people, really quite profound. Then beyond that, things that are to some extent tackleable. How do we get the level of attendance and engagement that we want? And this is where we kind of moved as quickly as we could in all our schools to live teaching, because live teaching engages kids in a different way to asynchronous learning, and is much more accountable, and we can look at what attendance is like in quite a different way. And then we would say parental support and extent of hard work are the other two major challenges. And when we surveyed all our teachers through the pandemic, we found that 80% of independent school teachers said their children were working hard at home, and 20% of academy, this is relatively early in the summer term, 20% of academy teachers said children were working hard at home. So over the course of this period, the schools, support staff in schools made something like 100,000 calls home to, a bit over 100,000 calls home to families, to provide pastoral support, to encourage parental support, to provide a bit of accountability, and to encourage some hard work. So in slightly more than 3 minutes, apologies, that is a quick run through the barriers and what we've done with them.
There's a lot to say. Thanks, Jon. So we're starting on questions now. We've got a lot from the audience. I first of all perhaps wanted to start with a question to Becky, but I think others will want to jump in on this. We've hit a lot of the issues and sort of small steps that have been taken to deal with those. Are there examples of things that have worked well, or examples of kind of best practice that other schools can implement, or that can be implemented on a broader level to deal with some of these really thorny, almost bigger than education issues? And could you perhaps talk us through one or two?
So Bethan, what's been surprising, well, as in so many areas actually of the research literature in relation to pandemics, is how little prior research there has been on this particular topic in the past, particularly, as I say, rigorous and school-focused research. So a lot of this is you know, in practice now. And we and other organisations have commissioned research on this, and hopefully we'll be able to better populate the field. But in terms of our rapid evidence review and the sort of outstanding literature, you know, the points about implementation are really key. I think that we've heard that from all sides actually just now, both from Priya, from the provider side. I loved her sort of metaphor of holding the hands of the school, but also from Jon's point of view as a sort of from the practice side. And I think that, you know, hopefully the remarks that I've made about the evidence about sort of quality first teaching and then facilitating that in different ways will be taken as a fundamental message. There are so many different issues, though, that coming off the back of that, I think both the kind of in-school elements that Jon's already raised, and which I'm sure we'll be discussing further, but fundamentally this issue both of access to the necessary tech, and then engagement, as Jon was saying, you know, being able to, you know, issues around attendance and engagement when kids are remote, so not in the immediate control of teachers in the school, are real challenges. And without being able to address them, you know, those gaps will widen. So again, I hope we can talk more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, perhaps Jon, you'd like to come in on that. Are there any sort of elements that you would sort of really push forward as solutions that could be adopted on a broad level?
In terms of access, particularly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, we have found, and this is a sort of financial point almost, we have found it relatively easy to save enough money to buy enough devices, if I can put it like that. Now, whether that is solely because of our scale, and you know, but most of our savings have been at school level. We have made savings at the centre as well, but you know, I do think schools should be trying to drive efficiency. I mean, sorry, this is kind of an uncomfortable message, isn't it? But I think schools should try and drive efficiency and savings, or hopefully did during last year, in a way which allowed them to invest in the technology, and that was certainly our strategy. So just to say that, and then there are some real positives in terms of you know, people's willingness to engage in professional development. And, you know, I have found, you know, teachers in our group have been just unbelievably dedicated and hardworking, incredibly kind of committed to doing this well, and have adopted a real kind of learning approach, wanted to engage with professional development when, you know, we've put on webinars and online professional development and so on, you know, facilitated by teachers in our schools. They've been incredibly well attended. So it feels to me as though there's a kind of teaching workforce which is kind of hungry to learn about this stuff. And the most important bit of culture change that's going on almost is, everyone accepting, okay, we can do this. We can still carry on with professional development and professional learning online, even though we can't be in the same place as one another. And I'm sure that's something we're going to keep as an education service and is going to benefit us in the future. I would say that the sort of overwhelming message I would give on solving the real problem, the problem that was most difficult to solve in lockdown, physical access to a space to work for children at home, the best solution to that by far is keep schools open. That's the place where children should be and can learn. And that's the thing that I would most strongly advocate.
We've actually had a question from Andrew Reed on providing a space for learners who lack it. Aside from keeping schools open, are there any other interventions from the panel that might address that particular issue, or are we really just looking at opening schools as a solution there?
I think the difficulty that you've got is that, schools don't only provide, we've talked a bit about EdTech, schools are not there just to provide the transfer of information. That old proverb, we don't know where it's from, but it takes a village to raise a child. That is often what a school is doing. Teachers are teachers, but they are pseudo counselors, pseudo parents. They're doing so much more than simply transferring information and it becoming knowledge in a child's brain. So, there is the question and the challenge of where the child works and where they're able to have that space at home. Some people, let's not forget, are in really disruptive homes, right? They're in homes where there is no parent saying, let me even find you a quiet corner to work from. Some children just find it impossible. And so there is no magic great solution. But what we do know from the pandemic, and I think this was very clear, not just from the evidence and the data that we've seen that have, got lots of infographics now on what happened, but we could see it on social media from teachers. There was not one teacher in this country who sat on their hands and did nothing. There were teachers who, on the phone about something to do with AI, actually they said, I've just come back from delivering 500 meals with the rest of my staff just to make sure that kids were fed. So what is the solution? Well, some children just need somewhere else to go. They need somewhere safe to go, not just key worker children, just children from different backgrounds. And they need to have that village, that support environment, not just about the transfer of information. And it's very, very difficult to think, unless everyone has got solutions, of any other place where they also feel safe, because some children go to school and that's their safe environment. And this is a challenge why I understand why it's very difficult for policymakers when this pandemic happened to try and think of other solutions, but where else can they go? And that's why the opening of schools was so crucial for so many people when we went into lockdown, because there were other issues that they were thinking about, which was not just about continuing teaching and learning.
Yeah, absolutely. David, go on.
Yeah, I was also going to make the point that we published an EPI report recently looking at various lessons from the lockdown from March, through to June, July, and looking at different parts of the UK. And obviously school attendance was phenomenally, surprisingly, pitiably low everywhere, even for those groups that were supposed to be the priority groups. But interestingly, we found that it was better in England than those parts of the UK that tried to have sort of hub type solutions where one school in a particular area would stay open. So it doesn't look as if that is an easy alternative. If we go back to a situation where there are some kinds of lockdown and we're looking at school access, children and families didn't seem to want to access the schools that they don't normally go to, or presumably are further away in terms of travel time. So I fear that Jon's right, certainly in the short and medium term, that the only likely better working environment is going to be in the school itself. And it's possible that some schools might provide elongated provisions so that children are able to work more within the school environment than at home. Some of them obviously will already be doing that, but it doesn't look as if there are any easy alternatives to this.
Absolutely, yeah. We've got a question from Caroline Sharp on whether EdTech solutions are needed, or what kind of EdTech solutions are needed for younger children, which sort of brushes on what Christian mentioned about early years. And I just wanted to sort of pose that to the panel, and also perhaps build on it by asking whether early years settings, or perhaps other non-school further education settings, might have lessons for how we work with this in schools.
I'm happy to
go for it
with this. And so with further education colleges, so I'll start there. It was really interesting how, I mean, for example, I think the last number last week was we were in 90 FE colleges. I think prior to COVID we were in something like 25 or 30, and there's about another 50 being onboarded at the moment. So FE colleges that have really relied on online learning, and they've actually been quite open to blended learning in the past regardless, but remote learning, it's been really interesting to see how EdTech has helped with that sector. Adult learning centres as well. You know, you can apply EdTech into all sorts of situations where it's scalable, it's easy to use. I think, and then talking about early years, but also tying into that, the key is, even if you're thinking about young children and what you want the EdTech to promote, right? Technology is to be augmentative. That it's not the only solution. What you don't want is children staring in front of screens all day, every day. That's not the ideal situation. In COVID, yes, we did have people glued to their seats and they were on conferencing technology, and then they were using some sort of EdTech to augment that. And that's an exception. But the idea is people have got to think, whether they're in early years, you know, primary, secondary, FE, adult learning, lifelong learning, what are the problems that you're currently trying to solve in your organization? Is it you need to improve outcomes? Is it literacy and numeracy? You know, is it teacher training and teacher CPD? What are the actual issues? Then you need to marry that with what are the goals that you want to achieve. Because I always say to people, don't buy tech for tech's sake. There's no point doing that, because you're not going to achieve anything. Because the second part comes with that embedding side of things, and that's to do with training teachers and getting their buy-in. And so with early years, there are lots of solutions out there. People are nervous about it, because if you spend too much time tapping on a screen as a young child, you're not practicing your fine motor skills. Fine motor skills are linked to literacy levels. You know, all of these issues can arise. So you don't want to replace what you're traditionally thinking is good practice with a screen and lots of EdTech. But when you're thinking about those problems and those goals, you have to think, right, which technology can help me solve those problems or achieve those goals? And there are technologies out there that are augmentative. And I know that Pearson, for example, have, you know, lots of you know, content in Key Stage 1, for example, and they look at literacy and they look at numeracy, and they have education. It's about putting the ed before the tech, if you like, right? And it's taking the ed and thinking, right, how can we deliver this in a really positive and impactful way that has been researched? There is evidence, there's the quantitative and the qualitative feedback, and then apply it that way. So there are lots of solutions, but it is about problem solving and delivering goals first, and then matching the solution to those, in which case you will then have a successful formula. What I don't like to see is people who, and I'm not suggesting that this is from the question at all, but it's when people say, shiny new tech, that will look great, let's put that in because our parents will think it's fantastic. It never works, because then you don't end up having the resulting impact.
Yeah, and perhaps if I can just chip in there, I mean, very much support what Priya has said. And I think, I mean, our approach is that EdTech can't ever replace great teaching and great teachers. It's there to amplify the impact of that great teaching. And we certainly see some differences between primary and secondary in terms of kind of just general uptake of EdTech. And I think you know, when we look at the pandemic and we're thinking of children being at home all the time, you know, that is quite challenging to deliver that same model that we've heard described at secondary of online lessons and so on at a primary level. And actually the role of the parent as the kind of learning coach is really important at that kind of early years and primary stage. But we do think, you know, EdTech does have an important role to play at primary. We have a literacy scheme called Bug Club, and we actually prior, you know, a couple of years ago, prior to the pandemic, did some long-term research looking at, we have a sort of an online world where children can access readers online. And what we found is that actually in the most disadvantaged families, children made 18 months progress in their reading over a 6-month period. So it was actually greater amongst those pupil premium groups because they did have access to a phone outside of school. And so, you know, they were accessing the readers, they were engaging with reading far more so because they were accessing it via the mobile phone devices. And in maths, for example, at primary, we've just launched something working with Priya called Maths Flex, and that's a practice site, and we're seeing great excitement about that at primary stages, because that kind of maths practice is another great thing that you can be doing with primary age students. So I think, you know, it is a different model at primary, and it's about using the technology in a way that has the greatest impact, and you can see that evidence of impact with those primary children, as opposed to that kind of whole scale, you know, get them online and teach them in live lessons approach that we're seeing a bit more at secondary.
Jon, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, just to say, I mean, I think it depends on the question which younger children we're talking about, what age of younger children, because I think the roughly speaking, the younger children are, if we're talking certainly about nursery and reception age children, the less actually EdTech is a solution, really. It can be supportive to a degree, but you cannot replace the necessary interaction between the youngest children and other children and adults. And I mean, not to sound like an EdTech skeptic, which I'm not really. We shouldn't be too starry-eyed about the potential of EdTech to fix a problem. You know, if school is not available for those youngest children, I don't think there is a solution that any of us would find very acceptable to the education challenges in the early years. Certainly, you know, it is a very demanding thing for parents to be homeschooling that age of child. So in our primary schools more generally, we've used a tool called Sway, which is just in the sort of Microsoft suite. I mean, other well-known packages are available, but Sway we found a very nice tool for use with primary age children. It allows us to, you know, embed a series of resources in a single file effectively, which is very user-friendly and accessible, can be directed a bit towards children and a bit towards parents, allows teachers to just embed videos of them talking to their class, and nice kind of question and answer routines can be embedded in there, as well as some teaching and activities. What was done with those sways, the younger the children were, the more those sways were directed at parents, really, in truth, you know, supporting parents to design and use activities as much as having child-facing screen time. So, you know, as children get into Key Stage 2 and certainly into older Key Stage 2, I think many of the solutions that are appropriate for secondary schools start to become much more appropriate. And I think, you know, the Oak resources, and as an example of asynchronous resources, you know, I think were well designed for Key Stage 2 on the whole. So, you know, that would be my view. And then just to say, I mean, all the epidemiology about this virus at this moment is looking actually quite helpful from that point of view, suggesting that both susceptibility and transmissibility in relation to those youngest children is much lower than in relation to teenagers, for example. And so I would just say again, the importance of keeping schools open, particularly for the youngest children, is particularly great.
Yeah, thanks, Jon. We actually had a question from Vanessa Hoosley on whether anyone could share any effective practice in sort of encouraging parents, particularly from disadvantaged families, to engage with children. I was wondering, Becky, if there was any sort of research on that you could point to as well.
Well, I'm actually becoming more worried in our discussion than I was to start with, I think, because it's really striking, isn't it, through the discussion, that whereas schools aren't equal, as we know and as we've heard, they can be equalising. Whereas when provision isn't done in school and is very reliant on home circumstances in a variety of different ways, whether that's physical, logistical, or the different levels of support and so forth and involvement that different parents can give, and just raw financial differences, we can see the ongoing impact, especially if lockdowns continue. So how to sort of mitigate that is I think a really direct challenge. I've been looking at some of the other questions in the chat as well about, whether it's ideal or not to have sort of 24/7 synchronous provision, whether that is actually positive. But also there's a comment, I think it's from Mary Harris, saying, of course, many disadvantaged pupils have genuine other responsibilities and challenges at home that are going to be inevitably really distracting. Your original question, Beth, was about parental engagement. Now, this is where my worry comes from. We know that, again, for a range of very understandable reasons, parental engagement, particularly for those hardest to reach families that David was talking about earlier, can be really challenging on both sides, actually, both for the school and for the parents. And the interventions here have tended to be ineffectual. When we've done RCTs, both for the EEF and in the wider research literature, they've tended to struggle. They've tended to be quite top down, and finding ways to engage parents who have almost inevitably had quite negative prior experiences of education themselves, and really to try to encourage faith in the value of education as well, can be really hard, and I think probably exacerbated in this situation. I think, though, Priya was making the point that we actually need to make efforts, if we're going to be relying on the online provision, we need to make efforts to do the work to basically inform and educate parents about productive online support at home and how that works, and also for pupils as well, because that self-direction for pupils is not necessarily something that we would encourage. We would always be thinking about primarily in face-to-face learning, but of course we have to rely on that practically in the remote context. So sorry, there's a huge raft of things there. I do also think, just if I may, coming back to the comments about early years, there's a real responsibility, I think, for organisations like mine, but also for the EdTech industry, to be embracing what are the innovations that we can implement to compensate for some of these challenges that we're talking about. In the early years, we know we have very patchy provision. The challenges for the early years workforce are very well known, and the issues about qualifications and so forth. Surely this is an area where there should be opportunity for EdTech to help to address that patchiness. There must be some areas where EdTech can mitigate inequalities, and we should really try to capitalise on those. Sorry, that was long. Thank you.
No, that's really great, Becky. I mean, in the light of some of that discussion, we've had a question as well on whether teachers are being prepared enough for this, and I wondered, Jon, perhaps from your perspective and from what you're seeing at other academies and schools, what kind of training is needed, and do you feel that this is being applied and provided sufficiently?
Yeah, I mean, really interesting question, and I mean, one thing which I think reflects something Becky said earlier, this isn't a particularly well-researched area of practice. What is good online teaching of school-age children is not very well researched. So the approach we've fundamentally taken is to say, and I think Becky suggested this approach as well, is to ask, well, what do we know about what makes for good teaching, and how do we translate that into an online environment fundamentally? And so I mean, again, I'm slightly conscious that we're fortunate. We're a large organisation. We've got 9,000 staff working in our schools. We've been able to work with a large number of teachers to support them to develop and refine their practice and to share that online with colleagues. So we've run a series of webinars for our staff with I think really good quality subject-based input from different teachers, and we've got a team of subject advisors who are constantly working with heads of department and subject coordinators in primary schools and so on to share the practice that we're seeing being effective in our schools. And we've done some of that for the DFE as well. So the DFE have asked us to do a series of webinars for primary and secondary teachers, kind of available nationally, which we have done. And those are, just to plug these, those are available on our website, and I think on the DFE's website, as well as just recorded webinars. So for anybody who's interested in that, and obviously a lot of it is subject by subject. So there is some stuff out there. I think it's good quality, and I think it's helpful. Is that enough? I couldn't possibly say it is. I'm very conscious that there'll be lots of teachers out there who haven't, been able to access that in the same way. And I think it's an ongoing need for us to work on it. And the final thing to say very quickly is actually the sort of teaching we were doing during lockdown, which is, everybody out, all teachers out generally and all pupils out, is actually rather easier than the sort of teaching we're doing now. The sort of teaching we're doing now is some people self-isolating while most pupils are in classes. And I mean, lots of people on this webinar will be experiencing this. We've got, I think we've had something like 5,000 or 6,000 of our pupils have had to self-isolate at some point in this term. And therefore we've had lots of lessons going on where teachers have been teaching live to a class in front of them whilst also streaming that lesson to children at home. And again, we've had to work through, I mean, let's say really the teachers doing it have had to work through, right, what are the issues, what do we need to make work to make that work well. And I would say that the one most important thing, my one tip for that, is microphone quality. The most important single thing is having a good microphone. It makes everything else possible. Without that, it won't work. But I think we should all be collaborating and working on this, because it's going to be an ongoing issue.
Absolutely. Sharon actually has to come in, and then Priya also has her hand up. I will just remind you that we're coming to the end of the session, so we can perhaps fit one more question in before we close and have some closing remarks. So if you keep it short, that would be great.
Yeah, so I mean, we've heard that last point that Jon made. Actually, we've heard a lot of that feedback from schools at the moment. That kind of mixed economy with some children in, some children out is actually more challenging in many ways to manage. But I just wanted to bring in a little bit of the experience that Pearson has in the US. So we actually have a network of virtual schools in the US, and we have 70,000 pupils at any one time that are within those virtual schools, and that's because homeschooling is much more of an accepted kind of approach and is actually funded by government actually in the US. But what we know there is that the model of teaching that we have is actually sort of 25-30% live instruction, and then the remainder of the time is the children working independently through guided materials and assessments. And I think it's interesting, quite a few of the comments have talked about, is it appropriate to have children in that model of sitting on Zoom or whatever it might be and being taught all day? I think what we've tried to bring from that to this is that the learning from that experience, where actually it's not about replicating what happens in a traditional classroom on Zoom or on Teams. The important thing is the interplay between that kind of instruction, which needs to be kept kind of concise and direct, and then the material that the students are given to work through independently, and then the checks to test understanding and refine, and then obviously direct the next steps. So I think there is a lot that we can learn potentially from elsewhere in the world, but it isn't just to be successful. It's not just that replication of what happens in the traditional classroom. And I think a lot of teachers have been through that journey over the last 3 to 6 months, where they've started with that and then realised actually the pedagogy that you use needs to change for it to work effectively in a remote environment.
And Priya, would you like to build on that?
Yes, please. So Jon said something really interesting. His question was, so what is good teaching and how can we continue this online? And it segues nicely into Sharon's point about, well, it's not about replicating a traditional classroom. And if we think about good teaching, we think about differentiation, we think about formative assessment, John Hattie's work on assessment, we think about the feedback, then they've got the pastoral care issues as well. But if we think about that, well, what I'm always trying to do is open people's minds to the fact that when we think about online and remote, digitization is not about taking what you did manually in a classroom and suddenly just doing it online with bandwidth. That's not what it's about. How we want to use technologies and then assess their impact is about digital transformation. It's about taking what you want to achieve, your good teaching practices, how learners take that, anything else you want to achieve, increasing agency in learning, increasing the ability for students to think about lifelong learning, so we don't need to upskill and upskill them and do national retraining schemes when they're older. They'll be able to actually seek those resources themselves. What else do we want to achieve? 21st century soft skills, as they call it. I like to call them core skills. But all of these areas that we want to achieve, the big question is not about, okay, what technology is there and how do we now do this online, because that's what happened when everyone went to Zoom and Teams, right? They were just taking what they were doing in a traditional classroom and saying, right, 30 of you sit on the screen now. And that's why teachers weren't sitting on their hands. But the big question for us now going forward is, how do we use digital transformation? What do we want to achieve? And what technologies are available to help us achieve those in a better, more efficient, more quality way? And that will open us up to new technologies, not legacy old software, not old learning management systems, but new technologies. And then we have to be very honest about what they won't provide, because what technology companies are really bad at generally is saying, well, I do all of these things, but actually you have to be very clear on what they don't do. And what you generally don't do, what they don't do is what the human does very well and what the teacher can provide. So I love the phrase that one of our head teachers, I steal it from him all the time, but he said, the technology is the sidekick to the superhero. So when he was looking at our tech, he said, that's what it is. And I love that. And that generally tends to be the headline when we talk about Century, because it is the sidekick to the superhero, but the sidekick should not be replicating what you do in a traditional classroom. It should be making you more effective. Why do we waste so much of our teachers' time? It should be helping with differentiation, with formative assessment, with feedback, with all of those things to then empower us. And we have so much to learn. We're not there yet. We have a long way to go, but God forbid something like this, prolonged or it happened again. We really do need to get a move on now to think, well, over the next year or two, how do we ensure that we can build on this technology, develop it more to ensure that we have that true sidekick and it's available and accessible to all?
Thanks very much, Priya. We have one more question, which I'm going to sort of bundle together a couple. Hugh Davies asks, is there evidence of the necessary radical and joined up thinking across government to address some of these problems around tech access? I'd like to build on that and ask, first of all, Becky, and if anyone else wants to jump in, whether we're seeing enough cooperation and work together, as well as assessment on what the impact of this is. Do we have a kind of map forward for this?
Thanks, Beth. I think there's lots of room for improvement here, both obviously on the access issue, as we've just discussed, but also on the supportive learning, both in examples of best practice from the sector in the way that Jon's just been describing, and indeed from sort of rigorous research approaches, which obviously would be of interest both to EPI and the EEF. So much more to do. I think, we were all struck, as I said at the beginning, about the differentiation in provision across the sector. And what's not acceptable is if a year on we find ourselves in the same place. We must learn from good practice, and obviously research has a key role there.
Absolutely. Anyone else on that question, or shall we move on to closing statements from there? Okay, great. David, would you like to go first, just for some sort of summing up of what we've discussed?
Sure, thank you, Bethan. I just really wanted to pick up 3 points that have come up from the discussion so far. I mean, firstly, Sharon's point about COVID having been in society as a whole generally a huge accelerator of changes that were already taking place. There are some changes specific to COVID that may unravel when this crisis is over, but in a lot of areas, and I suspect that online learning will be one, the crisis is going to accelerate changes that were underway anyway. So we do need to be thinking about how we can embed a much better system of online learning across our entire school system, rather than just viewing this as an intervention that's here for the current crisis. The second is, about some of the things that Becky has talked about, which is that this is a terrific opportunity for her organisation and others to, assisted by the providers out there, to rigorously scrutinise a lot that's been going on in this space. There is a flowering of activity in the edtech space, but often not enough evaluation has gone on so far about what is effective and what isn't. It's very nice for schools to have lots of choice in this area, but actually they would like to have some informed choice so they don't have to choose between 1,000 different products that might work, but figure out what the interventions are that are really effective and how to actually successfully implement those in their schools. So it's an enormous opportunity, if Becky's got the budget for it, to actually evaluate a lot of these things. And because they're often not government level policies, she can probably get away with making those decisions herself, rather than asking ministers whether they want to evaluate their own policies, which they don't always want to. And then the final point is the one about inequality that came out from Jon Coles's comments. I don't know whether he's been speaking to the same independent school that I have, but I had the same experience of talking to somebody recently and asking how much learning loss they were seeing in their independent school in a fairly leafy part of the southeast. And they replied to me, very straight-faced, that they thought that they were now in September slightly ahead of where they would normally expect to be at this time of the school year. So the inequalities across the education system are likely to be really expanding over this time, and our own discussion about how difficult it is for policymakers in the short term to deal with the lack of a conducive environment to learn in the home environment demonstrates how much we are reliant upon in the short and medium term on the school system doing its job. And that's why, final point from me, I think it is surprising that government hasn't yet targeted funding, in our view, adequately towards those children, disadvantaged, special educational needs, looked after, who are likely to have the biggest challenges and whose schools need the most resources. And worse than that, we've seen from some recent research by the Institute for Fiscal Studies and by EPI that the trend in school funding over recent years has been away from giving more money to disadvantaged pupils and has started to unravel quite a lot of the disadvantage premium that was implemented during the period of Labour government between 2001, say, and 2010. And I think this is not a time for us to be taking away that disadvantage premium that schools with those challenges need in order to be able to prevent the gap from widening.
Thanks, David. Sharon, would you like to make a few concluding remarks?
Yeah, firstly, fantastic discussion. Thank you to the panelists for joining. I think, I kind of end where I started. So I do agree with David. I do think this is an accelerant. I don't think that all of the change that we have seen will unravel. I think schools will embrace and teachers will embrace EdTech far more. When I go around schools and I hear about all the kind of things they feel they've learned, that's not going to reverse. I do feel positive about the impact that ed tech can have in personalising learning and really making a difference to a teacher's workload and really supporting teachers and amplifying what they do best. But there are a lot of challenges to overcome, and I think it's incumbent on the sector as a whole to really be open about those challenges, the different situations that individual schools face, but also families face, and influence and work together to see how we can, as a sector, as a whole, come together to address those and really make sure that the children who are at school now, you know, that this is a moment in time and doesn't have that much more significant long-term impact that we're all concerned about.
Thanks, Sharon. Jon.
Yes, thank you, Bethan. I'm not sure I'll even attempt to sum up that discussion. I mean, just a couple of final thoughts. I mean, one is just to clarify, really, that I think having live lessons and staring at the screen all day are not the same thing at all. And I think live lessons are incredibly important because I think access to actual human beings is fundamental to the educational process. I think teachers are the best educators that we have, and I think it's incredibly motivating for children to have direct contact with teachers, and there is no replacement for that. I sort of half agree and half disagree with Sharon and Priya on pedagogy, in the sense that, yes, you're right, I think, they're right, that you don't want to just sort of try and replicate the classroom experience online. But all our best evidence about what leads to good teaching and learning is based on classroom practice and experience. And I think if we just have a stab at, well, what would a different online pedagogy look like, we risk doing some bad things for good reasons, as it were. And so I will just be a little bit careful about kind of going too experimental too quickly, and we need to be very disciplined in the way that we innovate, test things properly, evaluate them properly, see whether they work before we start promoting them as a kind of system-wide solution. And then the final thing, we haven't talked that much about government. I think there's a risk, and I think we're seeing it now in the way that both government is acting and the way that government is being criticised, that people overestimate the impact that government can have in the short run and underestimate the impact that government can have in the long run. And I think, although it's very natural for people to be frustrated about the kind of short-term decisions of government, the bigger thing that we want to try and get government thinking about is the kind of medium-term opportunities, solutions that you know, come out of this period of crisis.
Thanks very much, Jon. And Priya, any final comments?
Yeah, so I mean, look, I think the point of technology is not to say we're just going to turn everything upside down. That's not the intention. But the point is we can make efficiencies. You know, when we have 74% 7 years ago, now 82% of teachers, this may have changed since COVID, but saying actually we're so frazzled, you know, we're so overwhelmed with the workload that actually want to quit our jobs in the next 3 years. And obviously they're not. You haven't got 82% of the profession walking out. But the fact is that they are tired, and we know workload is an issue. So using technology to transform the way in which they work, the way in which we can provide you know, things to learners is not a bad thing, and it's not necessarily hugely experimental to be able to do that. It's just how can we use tools and technologies that help. And when we're thinking about impact, you know, we can't forget the fact that, you know, we do trust our teachers, right? So yes, we can have quantitative analysis, and yes, we can have large studies, and we can look at research, but also we do need to also look at our teachers who are there using these technologies, those innovators and pioneers, those early adopters. And we do need to listen to what they're saying, because if we ignore what they're saying and ignore qualitative feedback, and we just want large scale studies, and I'm not saying that everyone's saying this is what we need, but then are we trusting them? Teachers do listen to teachers. I always say that because they trust each other in the profession. And so there needs to be a blend between, you know, between the two. The other reason why it's really important is because you don't want to stifle innovation. And innovation is really important. It's really important in education, as it is in every other sector. The last point I'll just end on is that, look, you know, there's an ecosystem at play here where we need lots of things to work together. There are disadvantaged children out there. There are vulnerable children. There are children with special needs. there are children that don't fall into any of those categories. But we do feel really behind. You know, when we look at countries like Uruguay that have fibre in all schools, we look at places that have managed to innovate despite very challenging circumstances. There is an onus on government to act and act quickly. And I understand that this is a challenge and it's all been an emergency and no one's quite had the right strategy. But this is the biggest lesson that we've ever learned, is that this sector desperately needs a lot of attention. It does need a lot of funding. I know everyone's always asking for funding and it's always very difficult, but you know, we cannot end up in a situation where in 12 to 18 months time there is not something solid in place to ensure that we continue to serve all of these children and our teachers, because they are just as important. But that's it, Bethan. I mean, I won't go on because I know I'm out of time. There's too much to say.
There's a lot to say.
Yes.
We can't hear from Christian, unfortunately, as he's had to run off to vote. Becky, any final comments from you?
I think you've heard a lot from me already. I'll very briefly reiterate the issue about how schools still need support. You know, many in the primary school sector, for example, you know, this has been very new to them. And I think that CPD and again, the sharing of good practice that I've talked about already is really important for good implementation going forward. And then I think I'll also just reiterate my call to the EdTech sector. You know, we've had a really good discussion about some of the exacerbating factors for social disadvantage in relation to access and engagement. And it's a brilliant opportunity, I think, for the sector to step forward with innovation to help address this problem. So look forward to the further debate.
Thanks very much, Becky. I think one of the main takeaways for me from this is that this is all just very much bigger than just tech, which is one of the reasons we've gone over time. So I won't say much more. But thanks very, very much to all of our panel for coming, to everyone who attended. Thanks so much. Yeah, hope you have a good. Well, everyone will have a final evening in the UK before lockdown. Plenty to think about. Thanks.